Dear, what is it exactly that people mean when they speak of the Trump mindset? Is it a man, a movement, a personality trait, a political strategy? Or more interestingly, is it a cultural virus, a pattern of thinking that has found a very effective host? When we talk about a mindset, we are not talking about a ghost in the skull, nor about some mysterious essence that descends upon a population. A mindset is better understood as a cluster of habits of attention, habits of interpretation, habits of reaction that are learned, reinforced, and transmitted socially. These habits live not just inside individual heads, but in media environments, institutional incentives, and conversational norms. From an evolutionary point of view, they are strategies that compete for space in our limited cognitive budget. Some strategies thrive because they simplify the world, reduce uncertainty, and offer quick emotional rewards. Others struggle because they demand patience, self-correction, and tolerance for ambiguity. Virtues that evolution did not prioritize when survival depended on fast decisions and clear enemies. This is where cognitive science earns its keep. Human beings are storytelling animals, and we are exceptionally good at constructing post hoc rationalizations for beliefs we did not arrive at through reasoned analysis. The Trump mindset, insofar as it exists, exploits this feature ruthlessly. It offers narratives that are easy to remember, easy to repeat, and difficult to falsify because they frame all counter-evidence as hostile manipulation. Once such a narrative is installed, it becomes self-sealing. Disconfirmation does not weaken it, it strengthens it. From the inside, this feels like clarity and courage. From the outside, it looks like stubbornness or bad faith. Both descriptions miss the deeper point, which is that the system is working exactly as designed. Notice too how this mindset treats complexity as an enemy. Complex explanations are dismissed as evasions, qualifications are treated as weakness, and uncertainty is portrayed as incompetence. Yet, complexity is not a moral failing. It is a property of the world. Any worldview that promises simple answers to complex problems must, sooner or later, collide with reality. In the short term, such promises feel empowering. In the long term, they accumulate errors. Systems that cannot acknowledge error cannot correct course, and systems that cannot correct course eventually fail, not because they are evil, but because they are maladaptive in an environment that punishes rigidity. It is tempting, especially in moments of political anxiety, to moralize all of this into a struggle between good people and bad people. That temptation should be resisted. The more productive question is not who is to blame, but what cognitive and cultural conditions make this style of thinking attractive. When we ask that question seriously, we discover uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our appetite for certainty, our vulnerability to flattery, and our tendency to confuse confidence with competence. These are not uniquely American flaws, nor are they new. They are features of the human mind, and they require constant counterpressure from institutions and norms designed to slow us down and make us think twice. So the opening question remains our anchor. What are we dealing with? Not a singular villain, not a temporary aberration, but a recurring pattern in human affairs. One that emerges whenever fear, identity, and power align in the right way. Philosophy does not offer a magic antidote, but it does offer a clearer lens, and clarity matters. If we can learn to recognize the pattern as a pattern, rather than as an irresistible force or a personal betrayal, we gain the one advantage evolution has always rewarded, the ability to adapt. Once we take this evolutionary lens seriously, a great deal of political confusion begins to evaporate. We stop asking why people believe what they believe, as if belief were a calm academic exercise, and start asking what those beliefs do for them. Do they reduce anxiety? Do they provide a sense of belonging? Do they offer a clear villain and a heroic self-image? From evolution's point of view, these are not trivial benefits. For most of human history, belonging to the right group and signaling loyalty to a dominant leader could mean the difference between life and death. Accuracy about the weather or the stars mattered far less than accuracy about who was one of us and who was not. This helps explain why reason so often loses arguments it ought to win. Reason is slow, effortful, and metabolically expensive. It asks us to hold competing possibilities in mind, to delay judgment, and to tolerate uncertainty. The evolved mind resists all of this. It prefers conclusions that feel solid and immediate. When a worldview offers instant clarity, when it tells you exactly who is to blame and exactly what must be done, it creates a powerful sense of relief. That relief is reinforcing. Over time, the mind learns to crave it, much like sugar or salt, even when the long-term consequences are damaging. From this perspective, the Trump mindset is less a doctrine than a user interface. It presents the world in bold colors, sharp contrasts, and simple commands. Friends are loyal, enemies are corrupt, compromise is weakness, and doubt is betrayal. Such an interface is cognitively efficient. It compresses complexity into emotionally charged symbols that can be processed quickly and shared easily. In a media environment that rewards speed and outrage, this efficiency is not a bug, it is a feature. Ideas that demand careful calibration simply cannot compete on equal footing. We should also notice how dominance displays function in the system. In many social species, exaggerated confidence signals fitness. The signal does not have to be honest. It merely has to be convincing enough to deter rivals and attract allies. Human beings are no exception. Displays of certainty, even when detached from evidence, can be read subconsciously as strength. Evolution did not equip us with reliable detectors for sincerity versus performance. As a result, we routinely mistake loudness for leadership and aggression for competence, especially under conditions of fear or perceived threat. Narrative simplicity completes the package. A good story does not need footnotes. It needs momentum. The Trump mindset offers narratives with clear beginnings, obvious villains, and satisfying resolutions. Reality, by contrast, is messy and anticlimactic. It resists closure. When people are repeatedly exposed to simplified narratives that flatter their identity and moral standing, those narratives become sticky. They lodge in memory, guide interpretation, and filter incoming information. Facts that fit are welcomed. Facts that do not are dismissed as propaganda, precisely because the story has already decided what counts as real. Seen this way, moral certainty without moral effort is not a failure of character, but a predictable outcome of evolved cognition operating in a modern environment. Our ancestors did not need ethical nuance to survive. They needed cohesion and decisiveness, but societies of millions cannot function indefinitely on instincts designed for tribes of hundreds. If we do not recognize how deeply these prehistoric mechanisms shape modern political life, we will keep treating symptoms while leaving the underlying causes untouched, and the same patterns will continue to reappear under new names and new faces. In my work, I introduced what I call the intentional stance, the practice of treating systems as if they had beliefs, desires, and intentions in order to predict their behavior. When people say Trump is irrational or Trump is unpredictable, they're often taking the wrong stance. Trump is not chaotic. He is strategically simple. His beliefs change because beliefs are not the point. The point is attention, loyalty, and dominance. From the intentional stance, his behavior makes sense. Say what commands attention, attack what threatens status, reward loyalty and punish dissent, reduce complexity into villains and heroes. This is not philosophy, it is ethology. Animal behavior, and it works disturbingly well in media ecosystems optimized for outrage, speed, and emotional reward rather than reflection. Once we adopt the intentional stance properly, the illusion of randomness disappears. What looks like inconsistency from the standpoint of policy analysis looks like consistency from the standpoint of behavioral strategy. If the goal were truth or coherence, the pattern would indeed be baffling. But if the goal is to remain at the center of attention and to dominate the conversational space, then abrupt reversals and exaggerated claims are not bugs. They are tools. The mind using this strategy does not ask, is this accurate? But will this land? And who does this put beneath me? Seen this way, the apparent unpredictability is simply our failure to track the real currency being traded. The intentional stance reminds us that beliefs, in many human contexts, are not maps of reality, but instruments of coordination. They are signals sent to allies and rivals alike. When Trump adopts or abandons a belief, he is not revising a theory. He is adjusting a signal. The signal says, I am strong, I am unafraid, I will not submit. Consistency is optional when dominance is the objective. In fact, flexibility can itself be a dominance display, demonstrating that one is unconstrained by prior commitments, immune to embarrassment, and free from the usual costs of contradiction that bind ordinary political actors. This is why attempts to fact-check such behavior often feel beside the point. Fact-checking assumes that assertions are bids for accuracy. Here, assertions are bids for control. Correcting them does not weaken the strategy. It often amplifies it by extending the attention cycle. From an ethological perspective, this resembles the behavior of animals that provoke reactions to test hierarchy. The reaction itself, not its content, is the reward. Media and environments that replay, analyze, and argue over every provocation inadvertently participate in the very system they claim to oppose. Reducing complexity into heroes and villains is another predictable outcome once we see the strategy clearly. Complexity diffuses authority. Simplicity concentrates it. When the world is divided into loyal friends and corrupt enemies, there is no need for negotiation, trade-offs, or institutional mediation. Everything becomes personal and immediate. This mode of presentation aligns perfectly with human cognitive biases, which favor agency over systems and intention over structure. We are far more comfortable blaming someone than understanding processes, and the intentional stance helps explain why such narratives feel intuitively satisfying even when they are explanatorily shallow. The deeper lesson here is not about Trump as an individual, but about our own susceptibility to misapplied stances. When we insist on interpreting every utterance as a sincere belief, we set ourselves up for confusion and frustration. The intentional stance, used correctly, tells us to track goals, not slogans. And once we do that, the pattern becomes legible, even banal. What remains unsettling is not that it works, but that it works so well because it reveals how easily evolved minds, including our own, can be steered by strategies that bypass reason while wearing its familiar clothes. Let me introduce another concept: memes. A meme is not a joke image. It is a unit of cultural transmission and idea that spreads because it is catchy, emotionally charged, and easy to repeat. The Trump mindset is not a political theory. It is a memetic. Only I can fix it. They are lying to you. You are being cheated. Strength means never admitting error. These ideas spread not because they are good, but because they are simple, sticky, and emotionally satisfying. Truth, by contrast, is often complex, conditional, and boring. And here lies the danger. In a cultural environment saturated with rapid communication, ideas no longer need to be true to survive. They only need to be contagious. Memes behave in many respects like living things. They compete for attention, exploit cognitive vulnerabilities, and mutate to fit new environments. The modern media ecosystem is a paradise for such entities. Platforms reward what is repeated, shared, and reacted to, not what is carefully reasoned. A metropolis identity that provokes outrage enjoys a reproductive advantage over an argument that demands careful thought. This is not a conspiracy. It is an emergent property of how incentives shape communication. When political discourse becomes meme-driven, the criteria for success shift from explanatory power to virality, and once that shift occurs, traditional appeals to evidence begin to feel quaint and ineffective. The meplex associated with Trump succeeds because it forms a mutually reinforcing web. Each meme supports the others. If they are lying to you, then any counter-evidence becomes further proof of deception. If only I can fix it, Then institutional checks appear not as safeguards but as obstacles. If strength means never admitting error, then correction itself becomes a sign of weakness. Together, these memes create an immune system against criticism. They do not merely persuade, they preempt. From the inside, this feels like clarity and resolve. From the outside, it looks like closed-mindedness. But again, that moral framing misses the functional elegance of the system. What makes memes especially powerful is that they bypass our reflective faculties and go straight for our intuitions. They trade in feelings rather than reasons. A well-designed meme compresses a worldview into a slogan that can be deployed instantly, without deliberation. This compression is cognitively efficient, and efficiency matters to a brain that evolved under constraints of time and energy. Unfortunately, efficiency and truth are often at odds. The more complex the reality, the more misleading the simplification. Yet simplification wins the evolutionary race for attention, leaving nuance to wither on the sidelines. This creates a profound asymmetry between truth and falsehood in public discourse. Truth requires maintenance. It must be explained, defended, updated, and sometimes revised. Falsehood, when packaged as a meme, requires only repetition. It can be endlessly recycled with minor variations, each iteration tuned to provoke fresh emotional responses. Over time, repetition alone can generate familiarity, and familiarity is easily mistaken for credibility. The mind begins to treat what is familiar as plausible even when it knows, in some abstract sense, that it should be skeptical. The danger, then, is not simply that bad ideas spread, but that the very standards by which ideas are evaluated are quietly replaced. When memes displace arguments, persuasion no longer aims at understanding, but at capture. Citizens become hosts rather than participants, carriers rather than critics. In such an environment, appealing to reason alone is like bringing a textbook to a knife fight. The challenge is not to outshout the memes, but to understand their mechanics well enough to design cultural antibodies ideas that are not only true, but resilient, shareable, and capable of surviving in the wild conditions of modern political life. Now to the heart of the matter. The Trump mindset will not survive. Not because it is immoral, though many argue that, and not because it is illegal, though law matters, but because it is cognitively and culturally unstable. Systems endure only if they can adapt, and adaptation requires feedback. Minds, institutions, and societies that persist are those that treat error as information rather than humiliation. When being wrong is rebranded as weakness, the flow of corrective signals is cut off. The result is not strength, but blindness. Mistakes accumulate silently, shielded from scrutiny, until they grow large enough to impose catastrophic costs that can no longer be ignored or denied. Science offers a clear lesson here. Its power does not come from certainty, but from corrigibility. Every hypothesis is provisional, every conclusion open to revision. Democracies, at their best, borrow this logic. Policies are tried, assessed, and revised. Leaders are criticized, replaced, or restrained. A mindset that treats revision as betrayal short-circuits this process. It confuses confidence with competence and loyalty with truth. Such a system may look decisive in the short term, but it steadily loses contact with reality. And reality, unlike supporters, does not applaud assertions. It imposes consequences regardless of narrative control. The attack on institutions follows naturally once error correction is rejected. Courts, journalism, science, elections, expertise itself, these are not neutral obstacles. They are mechanisms designed to inject friction into decision-making. Friction slows us down precisely so we can notice when we are wrong. From the standpoint of dominance-driven thinking, this friction feels intolerable. It interferes with command and dilutes authority, but remove it, and what remains is not freedom. What remains is a system with no internal brakes, racing toward outcomes no one fully understands or controls. Institutions are often dismissed as abstractions, but they are better understood as cultural technologies, refined over generations to manage complexity. You do not notice their importance when they work. You notice it when they fail. a legal system that no one trusts, a press that no one believes, an election process that no one accepts. These do not empower individuals. They dissolve the shared framework that makes cooperation possible. When that framework erodes, power does not disappear. It concentrates. And concentration without constraint is historically one of the least stable arrangements imaginable. There is also the problem of scale. Charisma does not scale. It can mobilize crowds, but it cannot manage supply chains, public health systems, or complex economies. Large societies run on boring competence, on procedures that function even when no one is watching. A mindset centered on personal dominance substitutes spectacle for administration. As long as the spotlight holds, this substitution can be masked. When crises demand coordination rather than performance, the limits become visible, and no amount of bravado can negotiate with physics, biology, or arithmetic. Evolution, cultural or biological, is merciless to brittle strategies. Strategies that depend on constant reinforcement, unquestioning loyalty, and the absence of criticism may flourish briefly, but they lack resilience. They cannot absorb shocks or learn from failure. Over time, more flexible systems outcompete them, not because they are nobler, but because they work. The Trump mindset contains within it the seeds of its own undoing, not through moral reckoning, but through adaptive failure. In the long run, reality selects for what can learn and discards what cannot. In cultural evolution, we see this pattern repeatedly. Simple, aggressive strategies spread quickly. They dominate early environments. They overexploit trust and cooperation, and they collapse, often taking much with them. The Trump mindset is fast food for the brain, tempting, immediately gratifying, and disastrous as a long-term diet. Cultural history is littered with examples of belief systems that offered clarity, confidence, and enemies on demand. They surged because they reduced cognitive load and promised decisive action. But like invasive species, they thrived by consuming shared resources faster than those resources could regenerate, leaving behind environments less capable of sustaining complex, cooperative life. The evolutionary logic here is straightforward. Strategies that demand little cognitive effort and offer immediate emotional payoff enjoy an early advantage. They spread rapidly through imitation, especially when uncertainty and fear are high. In small doses, such strategies can even be useful, providing cohesion in moments of crisis. The problem arises when they become dominant and permanent. What works as an emergency response becomes pathological as a governing principle. Evolution does not favor strategies that merely win early rounds. It favors those that can persist without destroying the conditions of their own success. Trust is one of those conditions. Complex societies depend on generalized trust in strangers, in institutions, in procedures we do not personally oversee. Aggressive cultural strategies exploit this trust by free riding on it. They benefit from roads, courts, currencies, and norms, while simultaneously undermining confidence in them. In the short term, this looks like savvy rebellion against elites. In the long term, it is a textbook case of overexploitation. When enough actors adopt the same extractive posture, the commons collapses, and everyone is worse off, including those who felt most empowered at the beginning. Evolutionary history teaches us that cooperation is fragile but powerful. It emerges slowly, supported by norms that punish cheaters and reward reliability. When a mindset normalizes rule-breaking as strength and frames accountability as oppression, it weakens those norms. Initially, the cheaters appear to win. They move faster, ignore constraints, and reap disproportionate rewards. But as cheating becomes widespread, cooperation unravels. Systems designed for trust grind to a halt, and the efficiency gains of cooperation are lost. The apparent winners find themselves stranded in a landscape they helped degrade. The fast food analogy is not merely rhetorical. Our brains evolved to crave sugar and fat because they were scarce and valuable. In an environment where they are abundant, that craving becomes a liability. Similarly, our minds crave certainty, belonging, and moral clarity. Memetic systems that deliver these cheaply are irresistible. But a diet composed entirely of such content leads to intellectual malnutrition. The ability to digest complexity atrophies, and with it the capacity to solve real problems. Short-term satisfaction crowds out long-term resilience. The warning from evolutionary history is not that collapse is inevitable, but that selection is unforgiving. Strategies that cannot sustain the environments they depend on are eventually replaced, often violently and at great cost. The Trump mindset fits this pattern not because it is uniquely dangerous, but because it is evolutionarily familiar. We have seen it before under different names and flags. The lesson is not to marvel at its rise, but to recognize its limits early, before the bill comes due and the damage is done. Here is the most important point I want to make today. Trump is not the danger. The imitation of Trump is the danger. It is tempting to focus on one individual as the source of disruption, to treat him as a singular villain who must be defeated in order to restore normalcy. But the more pernicious threat lies in the replication of strategies that bypass critical reasoning and exploit cognitive shortcuts. When politicians, media figures, or even ordinary citizens begin to adopt behaviors that reward attention over accuracy, cruelty over empathy, and spectacle over substance, the underlying pattern becomes self-perpetuating. The original figure is merely the initial vector. The disease spreads because it has found fertile minds ready to host it. Consider the consequences of imitation. When lying has no cost, the social norms that once constrained exaggeration and deception begin to erode. Individuals learn that manipulation works, that being bold and untruthful carries rewards rather than penalties. Once that lesson is generalized, the very framework of accountability begins to collapse. Ethical constraints, laws, and institutional checks are no longer shields, but obstacles to be circumvented. The imitation effect is far more insidious than the original act because it removes the phenomenon from the context of one personality and embeds it into the broader cultural fabric. It becomes normalized and therefore much harder to counter. Cruelty signaling strength is another example of the dangers of mimicry. Humans evolved to respond to displays of power and confidence. Social hierarchies are ancient, deeply ingrained, and neurologically reinforced. When imitation teaches that cruelty is not merely tolerated but admired, the social cost of aggression declines and the payoff rises. Individuals and groups begin to adopt behaviors that amplify in-group loyalty through out-group hostility, escalating conflict and polarizing communities. Once the signaling becomes habitual, it is no longer a reflection of circumstance but a template for interaction. The meme, in other words, has escaped the host and taken on a life of its own, indifferent to the intentions of its originator. Mocking complexity is equally dangerous. Sophistication, nuance, and deliberation require time, effort, and humility qualities often undervalued in the attention economy. When imitation normalizes the ridicule of careful reasoning, citizens and leaders alike internalize a bias toward simplification and instant gratification. Complex problems are reframed as simple moral dramas, and disagreement is recast as betrayal. Institutions designed to mediate intricate realities, ports, regulatory bodies, scientific committees are treated as nuisances rather than assets. Imitation transforms strategy into habit and habit into culture, embedding what was once a performative act into the collective cognitive ecosystem. The critical insight is that removing the original actor does not solve the problem. Once behaviors are copied and embedded in social practice, the culture itself maintains them. New leaders, new media personalities, and ordinary citizens all carry the template forward, often unconsciously. The danger, therefore, is structural, not personal. It resides in the ways cognitive and social incentives have been reshaped to favor attention, simplicity, and emotional arousal over reason, evidence, and deliberative thought. Attempts to excise one figure without addressing these structural factors are akin to pruning leaves while ignoring the rot in the roots. Finally, the lesson for those who value democracy and rational discourse is clear. Vigilance must focus on patterns, not personalities. Cultural viruses propagate through imitation, not mere presence. To inoculate society against the dangers of the Trump mindset, we must reinforce norms that reward truthfulness, empathy, and critical thinking, even when it is difficult, costly, or unpopular. We must design institutions, media environments, and educational practices that make the right behaviors replicable and the wrong ones costly. Otherwise, the danger continues spreading silently and persistently long after the original figure has left the stage. Not panic, not shout, not retreat into smug superiority. Those reactions are instinctive, but they are precisely the behaviors that make cultural viruses like the Trump mindset more effective. Instinctively lashing out satisfies short-term emotional needs, but it does nothing to strengthen the cognitive immune system of society. Instead, something far harder is required: sustained cultivation of mental habits that favor reflection over reaction, evidence over persuasion, and resilience over performance. These habits are neither flashy nor immediately gratifying, but they are the tools of survival in a complex political ecosystem, and without them, societies risk repeatedly reproducing the same failures under new guises. The first and most foundational step is to rebuild cognitive virtues. Intellectual humility is not weakness. It is recognition that our understanding is provisional and incomplete. Curiosity allows us to pursue information beyond the echo chambers of our biases. Patience with complexity enables us to tolerate ambiguity without retreating into comforting simplifications. And the courage to say, "I was wrong," transforms mistakes into learning opportunities rather than moral stains. These are not optional moral flourishes. They are survival traits in a world where ideas compete for attention and replication, where shortcuts and simplifications dominate, and where the cost of rigid thinking is often catastrophic. Rewarding better memes is the second imperative. Outrage is a powerful drug. It circulates virally, short-circulate reflective faculties, and privileging emotion over reason. In contrast, ideas that are accurate, nuanced, and resilient are often less immediately gratifying and therefore less likely to spread spontaneously. Citizens, educators, and media producers must consciously choose to amplify content that holds up under scrutiny, rather than content that merely excites. In this way, the memetic environment can be reshaped to favor depth over spectacle, critical thinking over sensationalism, and durability over flashiness. It is a subtle but profound cultural engineering challenge. Democracy itself is the third focus. Democracy is not a belief, it is a practice. Like any skill, it degrades when neglected. It requires participation, deliberation, and the willingness to listen to those with whom we disagree. It is upheld not by slogans or personalities, but by habits, attending meetings, voting thoughtfully, engaging in civil debate, respecting institutions, and upholding the rule of law. Neglect these habits, and the structures designed to sustain liberty and accountability weaken. The long-term health of democracy depends on ordinary citizens exercising ordinary skills with extraordinary commitment. These three imperatives are interdependent. Cognitive virtues underpin the ability to reward better memes, which in turn creates the informational environment necessary for democracy to function effectively. Attempting one without the others produces limited results. Intellectual humility without a commitment to practice produces polite passivity. Sharing accurate ideas without patience for complexity fosters superficial consensus. Practicing democracy without cognitive discipline leaves citizens vulnerable to the very cultural viruses they wish to resist. Only by integrating these practices into daily life does the society create a stable substrate resistant to manipulation. Ultimately, the challenge is not merely external, it is deeply personal. Each citizen is a microcosm of the larger system. Habits of thought, attention, and discourse accumulate, replicate, and interact, shaping the collective intelligence of the populace. By cultivating resilience, discernment, and virtue at the individual level, Americans collectively inoculate their society against strategies that exploit fear, simplicity, and emotional gratification. It is slow, often thankless work, but it is precisely the work that determines whether democracy and rational discourse can endure in a world in which seductive but brittle mindsets constantly emerge to challenge them. Let me end with this thought. The arc of human progress is not guaranteed, and it never has been. We often imagine that history moves inexorably toward justice, reason, or enlightenment. But these are not natural laws. They are contingent patterns sustained by conscious effort, social norms, and collective learning. Human societies are adaptive systems, but they are also fragile, prone to the same cognitive vulnerabilities that have plagued our species for millennia. Fear, tribalism, and dominance-seeking have repeatedly produced leaders and movements that appear unstoppable only to collapse under the weight of their own internal contradictions. The lesson is clear. The stability and direction of progress depend less on individuals than on the cognitive and cultural environments we cultivate around them. Mindsets built on fear, dominance, and denial have appeared before in countless societies. From classical empires to modern polities, they always feel powerful because they tap into deep-seated cognitive shortcuts, loyalty rewarded, enemies vilified, and uncertainty replaced by certainty. They always feel inevitable because their narratives exploit our evolved preference for clarity over complexity, story over analysis, and emotion over evidence. And yet, despite the temporary authority and seeming invincibility of such systems, they always fail. Reality in the long run is indifferent to slogans, charisma, and threats. The structures of consequence, feedback, and constraint, whether ecological, economic, or institutional, will assert themselves, often violently and unpredictably, on systems that ignore them. The Trump mindset is a vivid contemporary example, but it is not unique in evolutionary or historical terms. Its success depends on a host environment willing to reward attention over accuracy, aggression over deliberation, and loyalty over learning. Remove those enablers, and the mindset loses traction. It cannot endure in a system that values critical thought, self-correction, and the disciplined negotiation of complexity. The danger lies not in the individual, but in the collective susceptibility that allows such strategies to propagate and take root. Understanding this is vital, because it shifts responsibility from attempting to expel a single figure to cultivating minds capable of resisting simplistic but seductive patterns. The future does not belong to the loudest voice, nor to those who generate the most spectacle. It belongs to the most adaptive ideas, those that can survive scrutiny, incorporate feedback, and reconcile with reality. Loudness may win the short-term attention game, but adaptability wins the long-term survival game. Cognitive virtues, cultural literacy, and disciplined reasoning are the tools that allow societies to navigate complexity without collapsing into tribalism or demagoguery. If Americans wish to sustain a democratic system capable of handling the multifaceted challenges of the 21st century, they must prioritize these tools over transient emotional gratification and rhetorical flourish. So, be aware not of Trump as a singular threat, but of the habits of mind that made him possible. These habits are subtle, insidious, and easy to reproduce unconsciously. The temptation to oversimplify, to ignore inconvenient facts, to reward loyalty over insight. Each citizen, whether leader or voter, plays a role in either propagating or resisting these patterns. Political education, media literacy, and personal reflection are not optional. They are forms of societal immunization. Recognizing the distinction between personalities and the cognitive strategies they exploit is the first step toward inoculating both individual minds and collective institutions against recurring patterns of misjudgment. Because the most important political decision you make is not who you vote for, it is how you think. Do you cultivate curiosity, patience, and the willingness to admit error, or do you seek immediate gratification through simplified narratives and emotional rewards? Do you participate in practices that strengthen institutions, or do you cheer while they are undermined? These are the choices that determine whether mindsets that exploit fear and dominance will flourish or falter. The long-term arc of civilization bends only when its participants engage thoughtfully, critically, and collaboratively. In conclusion, the Trump mindset will not survive if Americans refuse to become the kind of minds it requires, minds that are reactive, credulous, and unreflective. Its failure is not guaranteed, But it is probable, provided society strengthens the mechanisms of thought, learning, and cooperation, that evolution and history have repeatedly shown to be resilient. Reality does not negotiate with slogans, and adaptation, not loudness, determines survival. By attending to the health of our collective cognitive habits, we ensure that democracy endures, that progress remains possible, and that the ideas which shape the future are those that can navigate complexity rather than those that merely demand attention.